Okay, once more, welcome everybody, and let's get going. First, there's the introduction of what just on a very
of us.
Oh, okay, that too. All right, you go ahead and start.
Yeah. So my name is Marianne and now you see the two co-founders of Puro.earth, so the Puro CO2 removal marketplace. And we sit here in Fortum incubator, so Fortum internal startups are hosting us at the moment.
And Marianne is more responsible for the supplier side, and while I am responsible for the auctioning and the buyer side. My name is Antti Vihavainen, and I also welcome you to this webinar. So firstly, let's go through how we basically ended up with the concept and what does it look like at the moment. So Puro is the world's first marketplace to offer verified CO2 removal certificates. And so the starting point was that there's already too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And even though there are lots of very good efforts to curb the emissions into the atmosphere, unfortunately, the evidence that is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere keeps on rising. And that's something that we need to figure out how to slow down and change the direction of that development. So while we were studying this problem, we realized that there indeed are many ways to sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, or take CO2 from the atmosphere and use it in some way. However, many of these methods are underutilized and therefore also underdeveloped. And the question that we asked ourselves was that how could we accelerate the development of these methods? And as in many cases, also here, the answer was money. If we can make money move to the people and to the organizations that run net negative operations, then we increase the likelihood of their development accelerating. So if we look at the landscape, there are companies, organizations that could do CO2 removal from the atmosphere. We've talked with these companies, and they've said to us that they could remove permanently some amount of CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in a product. But they need to have a monetization mechanism to accelerate the development. On the other hand, there are companies that have quite ambitious sustainability goals and want to become carbon net zero by 2025 or 30 or some other time in the near future. So to make these interests meet, we founded Puro, and which is basically a marketplace where these different parties can meet and exchange via the certificates and money, these interests that they have.
So let's look at it more in detail. What does it mean that we trade certificates? What is a certificate business? So on the left-hand side, we have the CO2 removal supplier. So basically, that's a company or a manufacturing facility that can produces a product, and they claim it to be net negative. So it can remove more CO2 than manufacturing of it emits. They make that claim to us in Puro, and we start verification process of it. So we have rules against which we check that are you following this rule, are you compliant with this rule, are you compliant with this rule, and also do the calculation of this net negative, how much CO2 are they able to store. And that is audited by a third party. At the moment, we are using DNVGL. After this verification work, we issue the certificates, and they can be put to the auction by the supplier. And what happens on the buyer side? So the buyer is a company, and they have some emissions which they know of. So they have done the carbon footprint calculation. They've done emission reductions as much as they can, so they know how much they have left this year and what amount of removal do they need to become carbon neutral or take a step closer to being carbon neutral. And then they come to the auction and buy these verified certificates, and the money then is going to the producer. And then the buyer can, in their reporting, voluntary reporting, include the emissions and show the removals and show the balance carbon footprint. And if we continue doing this, then this forms a market between demand and supply, buyers and sellers. And this will increase the investments in these CO2 net negative products, and they will be produced more. There are more claims, more certificates, more buyers, and this is how it grows. Here is the answer to the question, what are the mechanisms? So what methods of CO2 removal are we following? At the moment, we have 3 methods where we have the rules and quantification set. So these are the methods at the moment we are trading with. Carbonated building elements, biochar, and wooden building elements. And the carbonated building element looks like a stone, but it's made without cement, and it absorbs during the manufacturing process, it absorbs carbon dioxide through a chemical process that is called mineralization. So the CO2 turns into CO3, and that's a very permanent form of a carbonate that does not decompose. In the biochar is concentration, a chemical concentration of the biomass into very stable form of coal or carbon, and it does not decompose even if it's put on ground or even in animal feed. So it's a stable, fixed form of carbon. And then wooden building elements, if they are there in the structures, they remain as long as the Antti is playing with his phone.
No, I was sorry.
As long as the building is standing, the structures are there. And in EU, the buildings are planned for 60 years, so that fulfills our minimum criteria. What is common to all of these 4 methods is that CO2 is embedded in the product. So there is a product that has a functional use, like I showed in the previous picture, and the CO2 is in the product. So manufacturing of the product is the point of sequestration, and once it's done, the storage is there one-off, so it doesn't need maintenance or keeping it there. It is in the product. They are very long-term or even permanent. The mineralization output does not decompose at all, and biochar has hundreds of years of time, of stable time, and buildings as well, very long times. And they are all industrial processes, so the measurement part is quite easy. How do we find out how much is produced, how much CO2 is removed? So they have the equipment there, they have done their life cycle analysis. So all of these these were the reasons why these were picked to start with. And then, like I mentioned, they have a double function. So there is a functional, they are meant for building, and in addition, they remove CO2, so they have the net negative part. And the product itself is carbon neutral and a bit more, so it stores CO2 in the product, and that net negative part is the part that can be verified, certified, and sold on Puro. This is the life cycle analysis of the carbon footprint that we calculate all the emissions from, it's called cradle to gate, so from very first raw materials until the gate of the facility where the shipment happens. So all emissions are deducted from the CO2 storage that we can measure either with a lab test or from research. And yeah, as a final thing, what characterizes these Puro CO2 removals, they are all net storage. So they store more than they emit. They are long-term. Our minimum is that it has to stay away from atmosphere for 50 years, and all of these clearly fulfill that and much more. We are not comparing to any baseline, so if there are any emission reductions or replacement of fossil, that is not part of the Puro certificate. So it's only the absolutely net negative part, the stored removed CO2, that Puro is certifying. Ex post means that the storage has happened, so the removal has happened during the past year, and that's what we certify. And it's also a fresh, you need to use it in 12 months, so for writing off compensating the carbon footprint or carbon emissions, it has to happen within 12 months of the certification. So quite a narrow window where this balance is matched. And Puro started with these three that are in blue there in our big map. But we are technology neutral, so any CO2 removal method is welcome to Puro if it fulfills these rules and it can be measured and verified. And we have already had that happen. So we've had quite many suppliers of both these existing wood or carbonated building elements or biochar to come to Puro, and also others in other methods which may be eligible once Puro makes the rules. How do we quantify? So it's very nice to see that this is interesting to the suppliers, and there is supply, and we can develop supply. They can scale up and invest more if this works.
Indeed. Yeah, that was one of the key assumptions that we had in the beginning, that can we accelerate the development, and these are the indications that it is really happening and it is possible. Okay, and one of the questions that was asked was related to regulation or keeping this in a voluntary state. Obviously, we want to move forward very quickly, and we know that EU ETS is locked until 2030. However, it only covers 45% of the European emissions, and that in the overall, globally, the coverage is 25% when it comes to these various emission trading schemes. So since regulation changes to the regulation take time, we decided to go ahead with something that is voluntary. And with this voluntary scheme, we can already do a lot of stuff. We can, for example, prove that it is possible to measure and validate climate positive activities to the extent that companies trust the certificate enough to part from their money. And at the same time, we can learn about the utilization of the certificates. That means that what the companies that have bought these certificates, how are they utilizing those? I think there's a lot of room for innovation around that topic. Obviously, the straightforward answer is to use that in sustainability reporting, but there are other ways of doing that as well. So we've ran 2 auctions so far. And the first auction ended up, or the result of the first auction was that the weighted average price for the certificates was almost 27 euros, which is slightly higher than the EU ETS, the emission allowance price was at that day. And the next auction ended up slightly lower to 25 euros, and coincidentally, the price of the EU ETS was 23 euros on that day. So it seems, we draw the conclusion from there that at the moment it seems that the buyers value this higher than the EU ETS, because this actually removes CO2 from the atmosphere. We are conducting, by the way, interviews with the buyers in order to fully understand why they wanted to buy, and why they offered the price they offered, and how are they utilizing that in order to be able to improve on this later on.
Before next slide, I would like to point out that putting an average price like that looks like that is the price. In fact, all buyers pay as bid, so they pay the price that they had in their purchase offer. So this is maybe nobody paid exactly this price. That's good to remember, that it's a genuine auction. You set your price, and that's what you pay.
Yeah, if you get the deal.
If
there's the match.
Exactly.
If there's time at the end of it, we can actually go through the auctioning mechanism more in detail. Okay, so it is open, and for suppliers and buyers. The next auction will start next Monday, which is June 17th, so pretty soon. And let's look how that process looks like when joining. Before that, however, let's look at the process of becoming carbon neutral slightly from further back. So, there are all kinds of commitments flying around, and the Finnish government has just stated that they want Finland to be carbon neutral by 2035, and probably your company has made some, calculations and estimation when could you be carbon neutral. But first you need to know what are the emissions now, and more importantly, how much can you reduce? And when can it be done? What is the investment cycle, for example, for some production facilities or whatever it is that when does it become feasible to make reinvestments to something more economical? That leads to a question of the budget. You now have a certain amount of emissions, and you have an aim of reaching zero at some point of time. Now you can choose whether to go along a linear or reverse logarithmic scale or line, which would mean that obviously there's, if you choose the non-linear line, there's a lot more catching up to do at the end of it. And from the environment's perspective, that's less good than following a linear logic. But every year, if you're following that budget curve over there, there's probably a lot to be. You may be lagging behind in the actual reductions compared to the budget, and then there's the question of compensation. Now, there are relevant alternatives for optimizing the compensations. It may be the sustainable development goals that are UN-based, 17 very good goals. You may want to emphasize their weight when choosing the right compensation method. Alternatively, you might want to choose the best brand, the best company on the market that has been doing this for longest or whatever. Or you might want to then let's say, emphasize the exactness of quantification, or how well is it possible to measure and make sure that the CO2 is actually from the atmosphere. We appreciate all of these ourselves in our own work, but let's put it this way: we want to make the quantification 100% bulletproof, because they are, at the moment at least, industrial processes that can be quantified very accurately in the laboratory and in the practice. So in that sense, that's the first optimization criteria for us. So basically there is a agreement that needs to be signed, and it is one piece of paper that governs both the supplier side and the buyer side. If we sort of condense it as much as possible, on the supplier side, it's basically an exclusive relationship in order to avoid double sales, so that one company can only sell it once. The carbon negative part. And on top of that, to make sure that everything has been done accordingly, Puro also gains auditing rights to the facility that claims to be carbon negative, and it also allows, on the other hand, the operation of a supply aggregator, so that there's one company that represents several companies or several, for example, later on perhaps even farmers that act as suppliers to the marketplace. On the buyer side, basically agree that if you make a purchase bid and you win, you agree to pay, and there's a 14-day payment term and very simple things like those. However, what it doesn't mean is that if you sign the agreement, that would become there would be an obligation for you to buy or to make an offer of any sort. There is no fee to sign up or register at all, so it is all free. We will create an account to the registry, and we will create the user account also in the auctioning platform, and you will be able to place a bid if you want to. And the second point over there is that it is possible to name another beneficiary, so that if you'd like to become a sort of a reseller for these certificates, or for example, combine it with a product or some other company, it is possible to do that as well once the certificate has been bought through the marketplace. Okay, so how to join the action? First and foremost, send an email to contact@Puro.earth and say that you'd like to get the agreement for review, which you will then do, and it's a package that contains of the actual agreement, the terms and conditions, the rules, methodologies, and then know your customer form. Once that has been agreed, signed, we will create the accounts as said, and then you basically need to decide on two things: making a bid which contains of the price and the quantity of the certificates that you want to buy. Once that is through, the auction has ended. We will do matchmaking, and if you are successful in your bid, you will get an invoice, and then after paying that, you will get the account statement that says what the certificates are, and if you want to make use of the certificates, then you can cancel them, which sounds idiotic, but that's a normal word that is used in this context, which means that they can no longer be moved from your account ever. They are yours. They can be sort of accounted for your benefit. And from that, you will get the cancellation statement. And then you can use the certificates as you wish. And I think there's a lot of room for innovation there. So we ask all of you that have participated in here to be part of the solution. You can buy and innovate on the utilization, as I said, and then obviously share this message with your shareholders. All right, we've actually used pretty much the half an hour that we were considering to use in this situation. And now let's go to the questions. Now we have received many questions in the Q&A. Please send more of those in there if you have something to ask. Preferably not in the chat, but in the Q&A. We can control them there better.
Okay, so let's read aloud the questions and then. So the first question here is, what is the estimate of how large this market can become? And the honest answer there is that we actually have not used time on calculating that. We have been very busy with making it operational and running. So the main test was to test, is there demand, is there supply, is there what kind of balance between those, and will there be a price formed? So those were the main questions that why we ran these three first auctions, and we have not really spent time on thinking what the size of the market would be.
The potential is large. However, how large, we don't know. The scaling can be done both by the individual methodologies becoming larger due to the fact that they can invest more in them, and also due to the fact that we can add new methodologies that also expand the market.
Yeah, there has been, for example, a couple of mineralization inquiries that have been very interesting to look into.
Yeah. So there's another question. What other products can one imagine? Besides mineralization, biochar, and wooden houses, can CCS, which means carbon capture and storage, also be considered, stored in the below the seabed?
Yes, CCS, carbon capture and storage, has all the time been in our radar, so to say. And the other one, CCU, carbon capture and usage, which usually turns into a chemical product. If that product is in the structure, so if it's, for example, insulation, that would be eligible to become receive Puro certificates.
Yeah, but CCS, yes. Once there's sufficient, once something is actually operational, then why not?
Yeah, we are actually quite happy with that. The suppliers are finding us, so we get a lot of inquiries, and I think that in that way it works, that they come to us to make a claim, and that means that they are already in production. There is some maturity. They have maybe done pre-work for the quantification, how much net negative they are. So I think that's a very good way of operationalizing this, that they come to us.
Yeah. So a more difficult question.
Okay.
Many nations have net zero goals for emissions. Can they use Puro certificates to reach that goal?
I think in the official how nations calculate according to Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement and those government inventories of carbon, very many of these are not included. So they count emissions, what goes into the air, and very little of what goes out from the atmosphere. And some parts of these where which comes to the area of LULUCF, so land use forest parts may enter in there through other statistics, but most these mineralization, biochar, these are not in their radar. So
at all. So the short answer is no.
Short answer is at the moment no. Maybe it will change.
Yes, but companies can. In the outside of the ETS, companies that operate outside of the ETS, or companies that are inside the ETS and want to compensate emissions that result from other than the actual
energy.
Production.
Yeah.
Yes, of cement or some other product that is the main concern in the ETS system.
Exactly.
So, for example, Fortum is actually compensating all the flights separately from ETS.
Yes. So even all companies have offices and flights and other things that are not energy intensive. But I'll pick a question here for you, Antti. How is the EU emission allowance price defined?
It's an exchange basically where the governments auction these certain limited number of certificates and
sorry, I thought it was how was Puro price defined?
Yeah, but let's go through that. I think that's a fair thing. We still have time for that. So first of all, the seller decides to give some certificates on their account to the auction, and they will give a quantity and the floor price, and which means that they are not, they do not want to sell the certificates below that floor price. That's the minimum price that they set. And then on the other hand, there are buyers who are stating their purchase bid or their purchase price. And if the purchase bid price is higher than the floor price, a match can happen. And that will, the matchmaking will start from the lowest floor price that is matched with the highest bid price, purchase bid price. And this will go on for as long as they are evening out, and then at some given point of time, there may be a position where there are no more, let's say, certificates left with that price. That's called pay-as-bid price. And there is another question related over here, the type of not reduction, but type of removal. So somebody asked about can a buyer select which type of reduction? No, but type of reduction to purchase.
Removal.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and for example, if he wants biochar wood or so, there is a related question: can a buyer have a preference over where the reduction has been done?
Yes.
Meaning in which country?
Yeah.
Can a Swede buy a Swedish reduction? So Antti, what do you say to this?
Yes, so our initial idea was that we would not, that would not be necessary, because if there is no pick and choose option, then all the different methods would be competing with each other based on the efficiency, based on the most efficient way of sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere would be the one that always wins the case first. But after spending a lot of time with a lot of potential customers, we realized that there are indeed these sorts of preferences. So we have now allowed this pick and choose type of method where the buyer can say, yes, I want to buy this particular type. And for that, I will give this sort of a price, and that's fully feasible. However, since this reduces the liquidity of the marketplace, we have decided that will carry a higher transaction fee. So the earnings logic in here in the whole marketplace is that Puro will take 1.5% from both the buyer and the seller in a normal case. But if the buyer wants to choose a particular type, then they will get an additional 3%, let's say, a transaction fee for that.
So the short answer is yes, you can choose country and removal method, but it will cost you a higher transaction fee of 3%.
Yes.
So possible and a slight extra cost.
Yes.
Next question here is how large volumes have been traded in the first auctions?
This is a figure that we haven't stated at this time. It may become public then after we analyze the results properly. But let's put it this way: there have been companies that have clearly just wanted to get the feel of the marketplace and bought very small quantities. But then there have been companies that have clearly wanted to compensate the emissions of significant parts of their, or significant amounts of emissions. So we are happy to say that both exist, and these are not insignificant numbers that we are seeing here.
Yeah. So let's see when we analyze the three after all three auctions, we make the analysis and see what we publish then.
Yeah.
Then there is a question from a supplier.
We are starting to produce biochar. So which volumes do we need to produce per year?
So for the suppliers, Puro doesn't set the production amount. So you produce what you produce, and then you make your claim to Puro. So we have in this phase taken in very small, I mean, if it's a demonstration plant, obviously the production volumes are low, but if they are net negative, they can be brought here. So we verify them, and then you can see how much of that production is certified, or the production is certified and the volume comes from the production number and how much each ton of your production removes CO2, how much is the carbon content.
Yeah. Obviously, there are some limitations. We want to, in order to sort of manage the work or input and benefit, we want to start from the bigger ones. So the bigger quantity you have, the better chance you have that we will have the time and the effort to actually complete that. And now in this phase, in the experiment phase, we have done it so that the suppliers all need to be from within Europe, because our verification capability is only here in Europe. But the buyers can be from anywhere in the country, in the world, and they are.
Yes, exactly. So at the moment, the auditing site visits have taken place in Europe.
Yes.
Now I think we have replied all the questions that were there. Is there still someone who has a fresh question in mind, or did we empty the?
There's somebody who says, "Love your project. When do you hope to have a fourth auction?" Now that is a good question.
Definitely.
And we don't really have an answer to that as of today.
The safest thing is to join now and open the account and be there in Monday. When we say it opens on Monday, then it's open for 48 hours. So your bid has to come in before noon on Wednesday. So from Monday till Wednesday, you can place the bids, and then
yes, matchmaking happens after that.
Exactly. So no plans for fourth. Best to be in the third.
Yes. So the price. So obviously we are doing this in order to gain evidence that we can enter a scale-up phase. Now we are in experiment phase, and we want to move forward to an scale-up phase. And at the moment everything looks promising, but the plans are still open, and therefore we don't have the date for the fourth one yet.
Exactly.
So.
But the next question is the price range of corks in auctions. So cork is the name of the certificate, CO2 removal certificate. Yes. Cork. What has been the minimum and maximum price range?
Well, the minimum price that has been offered was 0.1 euros for one certificate. That did not go through. And the maximum, it was actually the same bidder who tried to buy a certificate at 0.1 and then 1 and then 5 and then 10 and going up from there to several tens of euros and just getting the feel of the market, what works and what not. So the range has been quite high, but not all of them have gone through, and the average price is listed on our. The weighted average price of these bids has been published on our website.
Yeah, so you can test, and buyers and sellers have been testing both of them.
Yeah, and now somebody asked, can you send us a link for the webinar? Yes, we can do that. So everybody who has registered to the webinar will get a link to the recording of this webinar.
Yes, definitely. So if you still have more questions, please write them in.
No, because we've used up the time. We are not in a hurry. We can spend the rest of the evening here, but we've promised this to be a quarter of an hour.
A crash course.
Yes, and we'd be happy to hear more questions. But if you want to, move on, then feel free. If there are no more questions,
looks like we have emptied the.
Yes, we thank you very much for the participation. It's been overwhelmingly popular, and the questions have been coming in very well. So looking forward to continuing the work with you guys. Please send an email to contact@Puro.earth if you want to, get in the action.
Yes, thank you on my behalf as well, and see you in the auction on Monday.